be up there, so you could go ahead and do that if you wanted to. Okay. So yesterday we were talking about some of the influences in voting behavior, education, geographic region, gender gap, things like that. And so I showed you this graphic. Again, this is in your book. And it's something that that piece in the middle, people devote their entire jobs to studying. That there are people who try and study what a Republican candidate should say to bring the women up to the line of men, or what a Democratic presidential candidate should say to bring it up from men up to women. That gap in between means that there is something, some sort of a disconnect between what a Democratic platform says and what appeals to the male gender. And so they're trying to constantly find ways to appeal to that and to make sure that things can try and stay closer together. And you will see that this has kind of come in, it's gotten closer and further apart depending on the year. So 1992 is a pretty big year for the gender gap. For the Republican presidential candidate, you can see that there really isn't a gap. However, there's a pretty low percentage of the vote, meaning that men and women can both agree that the 1992 Republican presidential candidate just wasn't something that they wanted. We saw, especially like the Democratic presidential candidates in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there's this huge gap, and that became kind of a concern as well. This is also a picture that's in your book that I do want you to kind of understand. Basically what this is an image of what it looks like red and blue states around our country. And obviously, as you can tell, it's a lot of purple. There are some predominantly red and predominantly blue areas, but in general, our country is more purple. Now, that is interesting because when you turn on the news, it doesn't make it, you know, our media doesn't make it seem as though we're purple. It makes us seem like we're red or we're blue. But the reality of the situation is that a lot of us, or a lot of the districts that we are in, tend to be on a purple tendency. Okay, so how do we measure public opinion? We do this through polling. And this is where political science becomes more of the science, in the sense that there are political scientists whose job it is to take data and interpret it in a very scientific way. It's hard because the data that they often get is qualitative, meaning that it's personal, it's not numbers, but they try and fit all of that data into a specific set so that they can make some good like evaluations on it. So last year, when I was going back to UW-Whitewater to be certified in political science, I had to take a class, a statistics class. I had to learn how to create data samples and to interpret graphic data. And it's fascinating. It's not the thing that I love to do, but it's the way that we get quality information. So opinion polls are a method of systematically questioning a small selected sample of respondents who are deemed representative of the total population. So the whole idea of an opinion poll is that you're trying to get a good sense of everybody by only sampling a small group of people. The Gallup Foundation is the leader in opinion polls. I'm going to show you the Gallup website here in just a minute. Gallup polls every day. They poll weekly. They publish their things weekly. People in politics always are checking the Gallup polls, especially people who work for the president. Gallup produces a poll every week about the president's approval ratings, and it's deemed as kind of the most reliable source of opinion polling. Sampling techniques. So representative sampling and the principle of randomness. Representative sampling is mixing up all the responses and just removing a handful. So the idea that we could, poll 1,000 people, we're just going to randomly or pull 500 of those as our sample. And that goes into this principle of randomness, that every person should have an equal chance of being sampled. To ensure that random samples are included, people who poll will pull things from different regions of the country, southern parts of the country, northern parts of the country, all of the coasts. They're going to pull women, they're going to pull men, they're going to try and pull people of specific ages. So if you ever get called for a poll, the first questions that they'll ask you are those demographics. What's your gender? How old are you? Do you have a job? They may ask some other specific things if that's what they're looking for, and then they're going to ask you a series of questions. They don't want to poll every middle-aged man who's white and lives in the American South. That's not a random sampling. That's not going to give you a good representation of what the country looks like or what the country's opinion is. And so it is really important to understand the randomness of it. It also means that when you're looking at polls, just like this analyzing polls activity, you have to look at it with a very critical eye. Just because a poll comes out doesn't mean that it's fact, doesn't mean that it's reliable. You have to look at how are the questions worded, how were they given this poll. If it's all done through the internet, well, people who don't have consistent access to technology are not going to be a part of that poll. If it is, through the phone, landlines, it's not going to be a group of people who, like you guys, who will probably never have a landline phone. So things like that. Okay, so problems with polls, there we go. Sampling errors. Number one, it's a sampling error is the difference between a sample's results and the true result if an entire population had been interviewed. You'll see in a lot of polls there's something called the margin of error. This is the idea that we have to account for the fact that we didn't ask every single person in the United States. We asked a select few. So it's kind of a calculation of what we think the margin of error might be. The next is poll questions. There are people who work every day in polling facilities that decide the language of the poll questions. And why? It's because you may not understand it or realize it consciously, but the way that a poll question is asked of you can often determine the answer that you give, okay? So for instance, if a poll calls you and says, due to the lack of, supervision of domestic terrorism and the Paris attacks, do you think that our country is safe? Okay, well, they've already kind of tainted your idea here with the first phrase. The idea of due to the inability of us being able to monitor domestic, it's already putting you in a mindset of, yeah, they said it, so it must be true that we're not doing a very good job at monitoring domestic terrorism. Now that may be true or not, but a poll isn't supposed to do that for you. It's not supposed to send you in a direction so that your answer matches what they're looking for. And so poll questions are analyzed a lot. And then push polls. This is where respondents are given misleading information in the question in order to persuade them. So that's sort of what happens if you're not monitoring what kind of questions that you ask or the way in which you ask them. There are a lot of polls that are done that end up being thrown out because they're not reliable and they're not accurate because of the way things were worded or the way things that were given or the way people could respond. Okay, so technology, public opinion, and the political process. So what does this mean for everyday life in politics? What does this mean for what the American government system looks like? Federal law prohibits any sorts of unsolicited calls to cell phones using automated dialing devices. So all pollsters now conduct surveys using systems, but they have to be they're a real person talking to you. They can't be a computer, and that's ultimately because sometimes the responses that you get aren't going to be, recorded well into a computer system. Public opinion affects the political process in many ways. So if you work for a politician at some point in your life, one of the main jobs of a politician's office is to monitor the polls. Often this is someone's job, is to monitor what the public is saying. And maybe this is about the specific politician, but maybe it's about the issues or the ideas of what's happening. So I'll give you a good example of what's happening. Yesterday I turned on the news, or last night I turned on the news, and I don't know the statistics because I was doing something else, but they mentioned that a certain percentage of the American population does not want Syrian refugees to come to our country. Now, there are people who are taking that, and especially politicians, and using that to decide where their position will be. No politician wants to be on the other side of the poll numbers, essentially. No politician wants to be in that minority because it's really hard to convince your constituents why you believe what you believe. Now, that being said, yesterday in a press conference, President Barack Obama kind of got a little short with the press because he said, I feel like Republicans, and of course he's saying that because he's a Democrat, but he feels like politicians are taking that polling information and using it to gain points in the political system. And what he's saying here is, Syrian refugees are people. They're human beings who have families and lives and dreams and goals, and they want to be good people, and they want to have a place to live and to feel comfortable. And you can't go ahead and say that they're not allowed here just because you want to make some voting progress in the next election. And so that's kind of the problem with candidates using polling information too much, is that the fact is that what happens in polling actually has something to do with your lives. It's something real. It's not just random information. If you don't want Syrian refugees, what do you want to do with them? It's not that problem just goes away. That problem is still here. And is the reason why you don't want them here because you want to gain voters in the next campaign, or do you have a legitimate concern? And in the Syrian refugee issue, it's this idea that people have this concern that if we have Syrian refugees in our country, it will produce more domestic terrorism. Well, that's sort of saying that, you know, white men who live alone are going to shoot up movie theaters more often because that's the last two men who have gone to do movie theater shootings. You can't generalize an entire population of people for a number of extremists who have decided to go ahead and wreak havoc in domestic ways. And that's sort of what's happening, is that, you know, you have to remember that politicians are kind of playing the game, but the game has to do with real people. Political culture and public opinion. The elements of our political culture include certain shared beliefs about most important values in American political system, including liberty, equality, and property, support for religious freedom, community service, and personal achievement. So we've come to understand that political culture and public opinion, there's some constants, which is good to know, that consistently when you're polled, you believe in the freedom of religion, and that you believe in community service, and you believe in these baseline things, and that can certainly help when it comes to government. And then political trust and support for the political system. The degree to which individuals express trust in the government and political institutions is usually measured through a specific group of survey questions, and this goes up and down. We have seen more trust in the government in some eras of our history. We've seen less trust in the government in some eras of our history. And one of the things you have to think about is what moves that? What makes you trust government more? For some people, it's when they see government doing things like doing airstrikes in Syria. For some people, it's when they see the president out doing things, like right now he's at the G20 convention. Sometimes it's when it's quiet. People trust government when nothing's happening. Political scientists are always trying to figure out what gains your trust in government. It's like the holy grail of being a good politician, is if you can figure out what your constituents want to hear to trust you, you want to say that, no matter what. Because the more your constituents trust you, the odds are better that you'll be reelected. And then a public opinion about the government. Opinion polls over the last few decades show a declining trend in confidence among Americans with institutions such as government, banks, and the police. So we have seen a genuine or general decline of trust and positive opinion about government. Part of that is because, in the late 2006, 2008 era, 2009, we went through some economic crises, and that typically makes the government look pretty bad. Now we're kind of on the upswing, so we often see that trust and that positive opinion go back up. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of graphs. One of the things that I'm going to really hammer home to you is when I looked through all of the free response questions that had to do with political socialization and public opinion, I think out of the 6 that have been published since 2000, 5 of them had a graph associated with them. You're often going to see visual data when we talk about political socialization and public opinion. And why is that? Because it's the best way to sort of explain to you what's happening. So this is a graph about satisfaction in the government, how the nation is being governed. So the blue line is dissatisfied, the orange line is satisfied, and you'll see that they move back and forth. And you'll also see that they never align with each other, obviously, because you can't be satisfied and dissatisfied at the same time. But what we really want to know when we look at this, and this is what the graph doesn't tell us, is what makes those things move up and down. What happened in like 2009 that spiked the satisfied and plummeted the dissatisfied? Politicians or political scientists are always trying to figure out what was the phrase, what was the campaign, what was the issue, what was the media like in these specific times to try and figure out how this all happened. You're going to see, like in 2001, there's a little bit of a bump. We often see with big national crises, we see government sort of look stronger most of the time if they handle it well. Things like President Bush saw his highest approval rating about a month after September 11th because he looked like a president. He was doing things. He was rallying our country back together. The patriotism in our country spiked at that time. We were all really proud to be Americans. We were proud to live in this country. We see that spike, but we also see when it spikes, there's often a kind of a downturn. And one of the biggest downturns that you see in this 2000 to 2007 is the Iraq War. Is this idea that we didn't really know what was going on in the country. We didn't know where we were headed. We didn't know what things looked like, things like that. So you can study how these things ebb and flow as you go. And then most perceived important problem facing the United States, this is a percentage of mentions on the economy. So they will do this on all issues: immigration, same-sex marriage, economy, climate change, all of those things. And they're monitoring how many times these words come up. And maybe that's in polls, maybe that's in the media, maybe that's in speeches, all of those things. You're going to see in 2009, it's a huge deal. Why? Because our economy is tanking. We're all mentioning the economy because it's the #1 issue. You would see something very similar in terms of same-sex marriage. And what you'd see is that spike is from about 2013 to 2015. It became this huge issue that people hadn't really talked about very much. So you can kind of see historically what's been going on in our country as we go. Okay, so we're finished with notes for today.
I'm gonna pause this guy. Oops.